He was 16 years old when the war found him. Not in a dramatic moment. Not with trumpets or speeches. Not with a clear choice laid out in front of him. The war found him the way it found millions of others. Quietly, suddenly, and without asking permission. His name was Karl Fischer. He was born in a small village in southern Germany. A place of narrow roads, stone houses, and fields that stretched farther than his imagination ever had. Before the war, Karl's world was simple. School in the mornings, helping his father in the evenings, running through forests with friends until the sky turned orange and the church bells called everyone home. He liked fixing things, broken radios, bent tools, anything mechanical that could be taken apart and put back together again. He dreamed of becoming an engineer someday, not a soldier, never a soldier. But dreams were fragile things in the Third Reich. By the time Karl turned 14, Germany was already at war with half the world. Flags hung from every building. Marching songs filled the streets. Posters showed smiling soldiers and promised glory, honor, and victory. Teachers spoke of duty more than lessons, loyalty more than truth. And boys were told, again and again, that their lives belonged to the fatherland. Karl listened. But he also watched. He watched neighbors disappear. He watched Jewish families forced from their homes. He watched soldiers return wounded, silent, nothing like the heroes on the posters. And slowly, quietly, something inside him began to resist. By 1943, the war was no longer a distant thing carried by newspapers and radio broadcasts. Came home in the form of shortages, bombing raids, letters edged in black. Karl's older brother, Otto, had been sent east. The last letter came in winter. Then nothing. No explanation. No body. Just silence. His mother aged years in weeks. His father stopped talking about the future entirely. And Karl understood something that no textbook would ever teach him. This war did not care how young you were, or how brave, or how loyal. It only cared how many bodies it could take. When Karl turned 16, the order came. Not an invitation, an order. He was to report for training with the Volkssturm, the People's Army. A desperate creation of a collapsing regime. Old men, injured veterans, teenagers still growing into their uniforms, children with rifles. Karl stood in line with boys he had grown up with. Some were excited. Some were terrified. Some pretended not to be afraid. The officer barely looked at them. He handed Karl a rifle older than his father, and told him to prepare to defend Germany. Training was chaos. They were taught how to fire, how to march, how to shout slogans that felt empty even as they echoed off the walls. Ammunition was scarce. Food was scarcer. Most days were spent waiting, listening to distant explosions, pretending they were becoming soldiers. Karl learned quickly. Not because he wanted to fight, but because he wanted to survive. At night, he lay awake listening to the wind rattle broken windows, and wondered how a boy who had never left his village could now be expected to stop the most powerful armies in the world. The Allies were coming. Everyone knew it. American and British forces from the west. The Red Army from the east. Germany was being crushed slowly, relentlessly, from both sides. And the regime demanded one last sacrifice. Karl was sent to the outskirts of a ruined city, part of a defensive unit meant to slow the advance. The city no longer had a name that mattered. Just rubble, smoke, the constant smell of fire. His hands shook the first time he heard artillery that close. Not in the distance. Right there. Buildings collapsed like paper. Streets vanished under dust and flame. The ground trembled as if the earth itself wanted to flee. Karl crouched behind a broken wall, heart hammering, clutching his rifle so tightly his fingers went numb. He told himself not to cry. The first time he saw an enemy soldier clearly, he froze. The man was American. Young, dirty, exhausted, just like Karl. They stared at each other for a moment that felt endless. Then the man raised his weapon. Karl fired. He didn't know if he hit him. He didn't wait to find out. He ran. Fear became his constant companion. It followed him through ruined streets, through bombed-out buildings, through nights spent hiding in basements while the city burned above him. He watched boys younger than himself die screaming, watched old men collapse under the weight of gear they were never meant to carry, watched officers disappear when the fighting grew too close. The Third Reich was crumbling, and it was taking its children with it. One night, during a chaotic retreat, Karl got separated from his unit. The streets were empty. Smoke drifted through the ruins. Fires crackled somewhere nearby. He could hear voices in the distance, but he couldn't tell whose they were. He ducked into a collapsed building and waited. Hours passed. No one came. For the first time since being conscripted, Karl was alone. And in that silence, a decision began to form. He didn't believe in victory anymore. He didn't believe in slogans or flags or speeches. He believed in staying alive. He believed in going home if home still existed. Karl removed the armband from his uniform and stuffed it into his pocket. He wiped the insignia from his helmet with dirt. He moved only at night, slipping through alleys and shattered streets, avoiding roads and patrols. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't keep fighting for something already dead. Days later, he stumbled into a forest outside the city. Exhausted, hungry, weak. He collapsed beneath a tree and slept for the first time without fear of orders or whistles or shouted commands. When he woke, the forest was silent. Too silent. Then he heard footsteps. American soldiers emerged from between the trees. Karl didn't run. He didn't raise his rifle. He let it fall from his hands and lifted them slowly into the air. 16 years old, covered in dirt, a child pretending to be a soldier. They stared at him. One of them swore softly. Another lowered his weapon. They searched him, took his rifle, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders when they realized how badly he was shaking. No one spoke to him like an enemy. They spoke to him like a boy who had survived something he never should have been part of. Karl spent the end of the war in a prisoner camp. Not a cage, place of waiting. Food came regularly. No one beat him. No one shouted slogans. For the first time in years, he felt something close to safety. When the war ended, there were no celebrations for him. Only relief and grief and the weight of everything he had seen. Karl returned to his village months later. What remained of it? His father was gone, killed in a bombing raid. His mother older, quieter, but alive. His brother never came home. Karl never wore a uniform again. He never spoke proudly of the war. He built things instead. Machines, radios, a life that didn't involve destroying anything. For the rest of his life, Karl carried the same thought with him. That the most dangerous thing the Third Reich ever did wasn't starting a war. It was teaching children that dying for it was honorable. Karl rarely spoke about the war after that. Not because he had forgotten it, because he hadn't. The memories stayed sharp, untouched by time. The sound of collapsing buildings. The smell of smoke that never quite left his clothes. The faces of boys who had stood beside him one day and were gone the next. In the years immediately after the war, Germany was a landscape of ruins. Cities flattened. Railways twisted like broken bones. Entire neighborhoods reduced to ash and stone. People moved through the wreckage quietly, focused on survival, on finding food, on rebuilding something that resembled a future. Karl was 17 when he came home. 17, but he felt much older. His mother cried when she saw him. Not loudly, not dramatically. She simply pressed her face against his shoulder and held him as if she were afraid he might disappear again. Karl stood still, unsure what to do with his hands. His body stiff from years of tension that didn't know how to release itself. Their house still stood, somehow spared while others were erased. Windows shattered, roof damaged, but standing. They fixed it slowly, one board at a time. Karl went back to work, not to school at first. There were too many gaps, too much lost time. Instead, he repaired radios for neighbors, fixed farm equipment, helped rebuild generators. Anything that needed careful hands and patience. He was good at it. Machines made sense. They obeyed rules. They didn't lie. They didn't shout slogans. They didn't demand loyalty or blood. People noticed. Work came steadily. And slowly, the war stopped being the first thing people saw when they looked at him. But at night, it came back. Dreams where the city burned again. Where whistles blew and boys ran forward without knowing why. Where Otto stood at the edge of his vision, just out of reach, disappearing every time Karl tried to speak. Karl learned to wake up quietly. He didn't want to disturb his mother. Years passed. Germany changed. Borders shifted. Governments fell. New flags replaced old ones. Schools taught different lessons now. The war became something discussed in classrooms and documentaries, analyzed with dates and strategies and numbers. Karl avoided those conversations. He didn't need history books to tell him what war was. He had lived it. In his 20s, Karl left the village. He moved to a larger city, found work in a factory repairing industrial machines. The pay was steady, the hours long, but the work was honest. He married a woman who never asked him to be someone else. She knew he had been a soldier. She didn't push for details. That mattered more than she ever knew. They had children. Karl watched them grow with a quiet fear he never spoke aloud. Every birthday felt like a victory. Every year they grew older felt like a promise kept. He taught them how things worked, how to fix radios, how engines breathed, how patience mattered more than force. He never taught them how to fire a weapon. Sometimes people asked him, "Were you in the war?" Karl would pause, then nod. "That's all?" they'd say. "That's all," he'd reply, because anything more felt like opening a door that had taken him a lifetime to close. Decades later, when Karl was an old man, someone from a local school invited him to speak. They wanted a first-hand account, a living witness. Karl almost said no. But then he thought about the boys he had seen die. The ones who never had the chance to grow old. The ones whose stories ended before they had a voice. So he agreed. He stood in front of a classroom filled with teenagers. Some bored, some curious, some distracted. They looked so young, too young. Karl didn't talk about battles, or tactics, or heroes. He talked about fear. He talked about hunger. He talked about how easy it was to be convinced when you were young that dying for a cause made sense, until you were the one bleeding. He told them he had been 16. The room went quiet. When a student asked him what it was like to fight Hitler's army, Karl corrected him gently. "I didn't fight for Hitler," he said. "I survived him." That sentence stayed with the class longer than any textbook ever could. Karl lived long enough to see Germany become something else. Not perfect, but different. He visited memorials sometimes, quietly, alone. Names carved into stone. Dates that meant everything to him and nothing to strangers passing by. He didn't look for Otto's name anymore. He knew it was out there somewhere, or nowhere at all. On his last night, Karl lay in bed listening to the wind outside his window. It sounded like the forests he had crossed as a boy. The same forests that had hidden soldiers, fear, and death. But this time, the sound didn't frighten him. It simply was. He closed his eyes knowing one thing for certain. That he had lived. That he had survived a war that never should have asked a child to fight. And that no matter how loudly the Third Reich had shouted its lies, it could never take that truth away from him. He had been a teenager against the Third Reich. And against all odds, he had won.